Welcome back to Forgotten Cars. Today, we're uncovering 7 secret Ford pickups that everyone seems to have forgotten. Some were powerful workhorses, some were built for a completely different purpose, and some helped change what a pickup could become. But why did everyone forget them? Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which Ford pickup surprised you the most. Let's get started.
1932 Ford Model B pickup, the V8 truck everyone forgot. Why did one of Ford's early V8 pickups disappear behind the legendary cars of the same era? When most people hear 1932 Ford, they immediately imagine one thing: the legendary hot rod, the sleek coupe, the famous grille, the flathead V8, a car that would become one of the most iconic American vehicles ever built. But there's another 1932 Ford that almost nobody talks about: a pickup, the Ford Model B pickup. And that's what makes this truck so interesting, because while the world remembers the 1932 Ford as a symbol of speed, customization, and hot rodding, Ford was also using that same era to transform the humble pickup truck. And the timing couldn't have been more important. America was deep in the Great Depression. Money was tight. Businesses were struggling. Farmers were struggling. And for many Americans, a pickup wasn't a luxury. It was a tool for survival. A farmer needed something to carry equipment. A small business needed something to deliver goods. A contractor needed something that could haul materials. The pickup had to work. But Ford was about to give that basic idea something extra: power. The early 1930s marked an important moment in Ford's history. Ford was moving toward more powerful engines and more modern vehicle designs. And the Model B era became especially important because Ford's new V8 would eventually change the way Americans thought about affordable performance. But here's the surprising part: that same engineering philosophy also reached Ford's trucks. The pickup wasn't just some slow, primitive machine anymore. It could have real performance, real power, and the ability to handle serious work. Imagine seeing one of these trucks in 1932. At the time, it would have looked completely different from many of the basic work vehicles Americans were used to. The body was relatively compact. The front end had the unmistakable Ford look. The proportions were simple but purposeful. And underneath it all was the beginning of something much bigger. The American pickup was becoming a legitimate automobile. Not just a modified passenger car, not just a crude work machine. A vehicle designed to combine transportation and utility. And Ford understood the potential. But there was a problem. The 1932 Ford car became a legend. The pickup didn't. And that difference in reputation would last for decades. Ask someone to picture a 1932 Ford, they probably imagine a hot rod, maybe a chopped coupe, maybe a shiny custom roadster, maybe a roaring V8. Almost nobody pictures a work truck. That's the strange fate of the Model B pickup. It lived in the shadow of one of the most famous Ford designs ever created. And ironically, that's exactly why it's worth remembering. Because while enthusiasts were dreaming about speed, ordinary Americans were using Ford trucks to get through the hardest economic period of their lives. This was a working vehicle. It wasn't built to become a collector's dream. It was built to earn its keep. And that meant these trucks had difficult lives. They were loaded, driven on rough roads, repaired, modified, worked until they couldn't work anymore. Then they were replaced. That's one reason so many early pickups disappeared. Nobody in 1932 was thinking, one day collectors will pay attention to this. They were thinking, can this truck get the job done? And the Model B could. That's what makes surviving examples so fascinating today. You're not just looking at an old Ford. You're looking at a machine that survived an era when America was struggling to survive. And there's another reason this truck matters. The early 1930s were when Ford was helping establish the idea that power didn't have to be expensive. The V8 was a huge part of that story. Ford's flathead V8 would become legendary for its simplicity, affordability, and potential. It would eventually power everything from family cars to hot rods. But before that engine became a cultural icon, it represented something very practical: more power for ordinary Americans. And that was incredibly useful in a pickup. More power meant carrying heavier loads, climbing hills more easily, moving equipment, pulling trailers, getting the job done faster. For a business owner or farmer, horsepower wasn't just about speed, it was productivity. And Ford was bringing that idea to the working world. But the Model B pickup wasn't simply about the engine. Ford was also refining the entire truck. The design was becoming more integrated. The cab was becoming more usable. The truck was becoming easier to live with. And slowly the pickup was moving toward the vehicle we recognize today. A machine that could work all day and still drive home afterward. That transformation would eventually become one of the biggest stories in American automotive history, but it started with trucks that rarely get the attention. The Model B is one of them. And that's why the question at the heart of this truck is so interesting. Why did one of Ford's early V8 pickups disappear behind the legendary cars of the same era? The answer is partly simple. The car became a cultural icon. The truck became a tool. The 1932 Ford car was photographed, customized, raced, displayed, turned into hot rods. The pickup was more likely to be covered in dirt. And that's the difference between becoming famous and becoming useful. But usefulness can sometimes be more important than fame. Imagine a small American business in 1932. The owner doesn't care whether his truck will become collectible 80 years later. He cares whether it starts in the morning, whether it can carry his equipment, whether it can deliver products, whether it can make money. That's what the Model B was built for. And in that sense, it was incredibly successful. It represented Ford's attempt to give working Americans something they desperately needed, an affordable truck with modern performance. And that philosophy would continue for generations. The trucks would get bigger, more powerful, more comfortable, more sophisticated. Eventually, Ford would create the F-Series, then the F-100, then the F-150. And decades later, the pickup would become one of the most important vehicles in America. But long before that, Ford was learning what Americans wanted from a truck. The Model B pickup was part of that experiment. It helped prove that a pickup could be more than a basic work machine. It could have personality, it could have power, and it could share much of the engineering progress happening in Ford's passenger cars. That's a major reason this truck deserves a place in automotive history. Not because it was the fastest, not because it was the rarest, and not because it became the most valuable, but because it appeared at an important turning point. America was changing, Ford was changing, and the pickup was changing with it. There's something almost ironic about the fact that the 1932 Ford pickup is forgotten because the 1932 Ford car became too famous. The same year, the same Ford era, the same revolutionary V8 story, but completely different destinies. One became a hot rod legend, the other became a forgotten horsework. And perhaps that's why seeing one today feels so unusual. You look at the body and immediately recognize the era, but then you realize this isn't the famous Ford you expected. It's the truck, the one that was probably working while the cars were getting all the attention. And that's exactly what makes it special, because automotive history isn't only about the cars that became icons. It's also about the vehicles that quietly changed everyday life. The Model B pickup was one of those vehicles. It helped bring Ford's new generation of power into the working world. It represented a new direction for American pickups, and it showed that a pickup could be practical without being primitive. So the next time you see a famous 1932 Ford hot rod, remember something. There was another Ford from the same era, one that carried tools instead of trophies, one that hauled cargo instead of winning races, one that helped ordinary Americans keep working during one of the hardest periods in American history. The 1932 Ford Model B pickup. It may not have become a legend like the coupe, but without trucks like this, the American pickup story would look very different.
2. 1935 Ford Model 50 pickup, the work truck with a V8. How did Ford put a V8 into a basic work truck when most pickups were still incredibly primitive? When you think of a 1935 Ford, you probably imagine an old-fashioned car from the Depression era. But Ford was doing something surprisingly advanced with its trucks. This was the Ford Model 50 pickup, a simple-looking work truck with something hiding under the hood that changed everything, a Ford Flathead V8. And that was a big deal, because in the mid-1930s, the American pickup was still a very basic machine. A truck was built to work. It didn't need to be comfortable, it didn't need to be fast, and it certainly didn't need the kind of engine that would eventually become famous among hot rodders. But Ford had a different idea. Why couldn't a working man have V8 power too? The answer became the Model 50. At the time, America was still struggling through the Great Depression. Money was scarce, businesses were fighting to survive, farmers were trying to make a living. Every mile driven and every load carried mattered. For someone who depended on a truck, power wasn't about showing off. Power meant getting the job done. A stronger engine could carry heavier loads, it could climb difficult roads, it could haul equipment. It could simply make the truck more useful. And Ford's flathead V8 gave the Model 50 something most basic pickups of the period simply didn't have: serious horsepower. That's what makes this truck so fascinating. From the outside, it wasn't some futuristic machine. It still looked like a traditional 1930s American pickup. The body was simple, the cab was compact, the cargo bed was practical, but underneath that straightforward exterior was an engine that would become one of the most famous V8s in American history. Ford had introduced its affordable V8 earlier in the decade, and now that technology was making its way into the working world. That was a major shift, because suddenly you didn't have to choose between a useful truck and a powerful engine. You could have both. And that idea would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of the American pickup. But in 1935, it was still pretty unusual. Imagine being a farmer or small business owner in 1935. You walk into a Ford dealership, you expect to see a basic work truck, something slow, something rugged, something designed to survive abuse. Instead, you're offered a half-ton pickup with a V8. You might ask, why does a work truck need that much power? And that's exactly the question Ford was answering, because America was changing, roads were improving, businesses were expanding, people were traveling farther, and trucks were being asked to do more. Ford wasn't simply selling horsepower, it was selling capability. And that distinction matters. The Model 50 wasn't created to become a hot rod, it was created to work. But the same characteristics that made it useful as a truck would later make the flathead V8 incredibly popular with enthusiasts. Compact design, simple mechanical construction, strong aftermarket potential, and plenty of character. The hot rodding world would eventually turn the flathead V8 into a legend, but before enthusiasts started modifying these engines, ordinary Americans were using them to haul lumber, equipment, tools, and supplies. That's the part of the story that's easy to forget. The V8 wasn't just a performance engine. For Ford, it was also a workhorse, and that made the Model 50 particularly important. It represented the beginning of a new philosophy. A pickup doesn't have to be slow just because it's a work vehicle. That idea would eventually spread throughout the American truck industry. More horsepower, more payload, better transmissions, better brakes, better suspension, more comfort. But all of that development had to start somewhere, and trucks like the Model 50 were part of that transition. There's also something visually interesting about this Ford. The design sits right between two eras. It still has the classic upright proportions of an early American truck, but the styling is becoming smoother, more integrated, more automobile-like. The truck is beginning to look less like a collection of separate mechanical parts and more like a complete vehicle. That evolution was important because the American pickup was slowly moving towards becoming something people would actually want to own, not simply something they had to own. But there's a strange irony here. The Model 50 is historically important. The flathead V8 became legendary. Ford's trucks became hugely successful. Yet the 1935 Model 50 itself isn't nearly as recognizable as later Ford pickups. Ask someone to name a classic Ford truck. They might say F100, they might say F1, they might mention a 1950s style side, but the Model 50? Most people have never heard of it. And that's what makes it perfect for a forgotten truck story, because this truck was part of a much bigger revolution. It was helping Ford redefine what an affordable work truck could be. A pickup didn't have to be primitive, it could be practical and powerful. It could carry a load and still have an engine worth talking about. It could be built for ordinary workers while using technology that would eventually become legendary. That's exactly what the Model 50 represented. Today, a surviving example is more than just an old Ford pickup. It's a snapshot of an important moment in American automotive history. A moment when the country was struggling economically, but the automobile industry was still moving forward. A moment when Ford was taking the V8 out of the world of expensive performance and putting it into the hands of ordinary American workers. And that's why this truck deserves to be remembered. Not because it was flashy, not because it was luxurious, but because it quietly changed expectations. Before the Model 50, a basic pickup was expected to be basic. After trucks like this, people began to realize that work and performance could exist in the same vehicle. That idea would eventually become completely normal, but in 1935, it was something special. And perhaps that's the real story of the Ford Model 50 pickup. It wasn't trying to become a legend, it was simply trying to help people work. But underneath that simple body was a V8 that would become one of the most famous engines in American history. A basic work truck with the heart of a legend.
3. 1948 Ford F2 pickup, the forgotten middle child. Why does everyone remember the F-Series name, but almost nobody remembers the F2 that helped build it? When you hear Ford F-Series, one name probably comes to mind immediately: F-150. Maybe you think of the F-100, maybe an old F-1. But almost nobody immediately thinks about the 1948 Ford F2. And that's strange, because the F2 was part of the very beginning of the F-Series story. In fact, it helped establish an idea that would become incredibly important for Ford: one truck family for almost any kind of buyer. Before the F-Series appeared, Ford's truck lineup was much more fragmented. Different trucks served different jobs. But after World War II, America was changing. Businesses were growing, construction was booming, farmers were rebuilding, new roads were being built, and Americans needed more capable vehicles. Ford realized that it couldn't simply offer one basic pickup and expect it to satisfy everyone. Some buyers needed a light truck, others needed something stronger, and some needed a serious commercial vehicle. That's where the F-Series came in. Introduced for the 1948 model year, Ford created a new family of trucks. The F1 was the light-duty pickup, the F2 sat above it, and the F3 offered even more capability. The idea was simple: choose the truck that fits the job. And the F2 was right in the middle. It wasn't the smallest Ford pickup, but it wasn't a huge commercial truck either. It was designed for people who needed something tougher than the basic half-ton without going all the way into heavy-duty territory. And that sounds completely normal today, but this was an important development because Ford was beginning to build something bigger than individual truck models. It was building a truck family, and that concept would eventually become one of the biggest advantages of the F-Series. Think about a farmer who needs to carry heavier equipment, or a contractor transporting building materials, or a small business owner making deliveries. The F1 might not provide enough capability, but a heavy commercial truck would be unnecessary. The F2 filled that gap. It was the middle ground, and sometimes the middle ground is exactly what people need. But here's the problem with being the middle child: you get forgotten. The F1 had the historical advantage of being the original light-duty F-Series pickup. The later F100 became famous, and eventually the F150 became one of the most recognizable vehicles in America. The F2? It disappeared into the background. Yet without trucks like it, the F-Series wouldn't have become the massive family it eventually became. The genius of Ford's approach was that customers didn't have to leave the brand as their needs changed. Maybe you started with a lighter truck, then your business grew. You needed more capability. Ford had another F-Series model ready. You didn't necessarily have to switch manufacturers. That created loyalty, and loyalty became incredibly valuable.
This was especially important in post-war America. The country was entering a period of rapid economic growth. Businesses were expanding, construction was booming, suburbs were spreading, and trucks were becoming essential. Ford needed to be ready for all of it. The F2 was part of that strategy. And there's another reason this truck is interesting. It shows how different the meaning of a pickup was in 1948. Today, people often think of a pickup as a personal vehicle, something you drive to work, take on a road trip, use around town, maybe tow a trailer on weekends. But in 1948, trucks were still deeply connected to work. The F2 was designed around a simple question: how much work do you need this truck to do? If the answer was more than a light pickup but less than a heavy commercial truck, the F2 made sense. It was a practical solution, and Ford was very good at creating practical solutions. The first generation F-Series also represented a major change in truck design. Ford wanted the new trucks to be more comfortable. The cab was wider, visibility was improved, the windshield was larger, the interior was more usable. The truck wasn't simply a mechanical workhorse anymore. Ford was starting to understand that the driver mattered too. That idea would become increasingly important over the following decades. But the F2 was still fundamentally a working vehicle. Its purpose was clear: carry more, work harder, last longer, and get the job done. That's why the truck is so fascinating today. There's nothing flashy about it. No giant fins, no wild chrome, no muscle car engine, no strange body design. It's simply a serious post-war Ford truck. And that's exactly why most people overlook it. Automotive history tends to remember the extremes: the first model, the most famous model, the fastest model, the rarest model. The F2 wasn't necessarily any of those things. It was the useful middle. But that middle was extremely important because it helped prove that the F-Series could serve different kinds of customers. And that concept would eventually become the foundation of Ford's truck empire. Imagine the Ford dealership in 1948. A customer walks in. He explains what he needs. The salesman doesn't have to say, "Ford doesn't make that." Instead, he can point to the lineup: F1, F2, F3. Different sizes, different capabilities, same family. That was a powerful sales strategy, and it would become even more important as the decades passed. Ford kept expanding the range. The names changed, the designs changed, the engines changed, the technology changed, but the basic idea remained: there's an F-Series truck for you. That's the legacy the F2 helped establish. And yet today it's almost invisible. That's the irony. The F-Series name became legendary. The individual F2 became forgotten. It's almost as if history remembered the family but forgot one of its children. And there's another reason this truck is interesting: because it represents a period when Ford was still figuring out what the F-Series would become. Nobody in 1948 knew that this truck family would eventually dominate the American pickup market. Nobody knew there would be F100s. Nobody knew there would be F150s. Nobody knew the name would become one of the biggest badges in automotive history. At the time, it was simply a new generation of Ford trucks, and the F2 was one of the pieces of that experiment. That's why finding one today is so interesting. You might see an old Ford sitting at a car show and immediately assume it's an F1. Then you look closer. The badge tells a different story. It's an F2. And suddenly the truck becomes much more interesting because you're looking at a model that helped define the range of the first F-Series generation. A truck designed for buyers who needed something in between, not too small, not too big, just capable enough. And sometimes those middle vehicles are the first to disappear. They don't have a dramatic story. They don't have a crazy design. They simply did their job, and then they were replaced. But the F2 deserves better than that, because it was part of the foundation. It helped Ford discover that the future of the pickup wasn't just one truck, it was an entire family. That idea would eventually become enormously successful. So when you hear the words Ford F-Series, don't think only about the F-150. Think about where the story began. Think about the F1. Think about the F2. Think about the F3. And remember that before the F-Series became an American institution, it was simply a new idea trying to find its place.
The 1948 Ford F2 was one of the trucks that made that idea work. It wasn't the most famous, it wasn't the flashiest, but it filled a crucial gap. And that's why the mystery remains. Why does everyone remember the F-Series name, but almost nobody remembers the F2 that helped build it? Because the F2 wasn't the star. It was something more important, part of the foundation that made the star possible.
4. 1953 Ford F-250, the workhorse behind the legend. Why did this Ford become one of the most important workhorses in the lineup, yet remain in the shadow of the famous F-100? When people hear classic Ford pickup, they usually think of the F-100. The name is legendary. But sitting quietly beside it was another truck that was built for a very different purpose, the Ford F-250. And this truck wasn't trying to be famous, it was trying to work. By 1953, America was entering a new era of growth. Construction was booming, farms were becoming more mechanized, businesses were expanding, and people needed trucks capable of handling serious jobs. A basic half-ton pickup was useful, but sometimes it simply wasn't enough. You needed more payload, more durability, more capability. That's where the F-250 came in. It occupied an important position in Ford's lineup. It was heavier and more capable than the lighter-duty pickup, but it wasn't necessarily a giant commercial truck. It was the truck for someone who had real work to do. And that's what makes the F-250 so interesting, because while the F-100 became the glamorous classic, the F-250 was often the truck actually doing the hard work. Imagine a contractor in the 1950s. He's hauling lumber, tools, equipment, maybe a trailer, maybe heavy materials. He doesn't need a flashy truck. He needs something that won't complain when the load gets serious. The F-250 was built for exactly that kind of buyer. And this was becoming increasingly important in post-war America. The country was building everything: new houses, new roads, new businesses, new communities. And behind all of that construction were trucks, lots of trucks. The pickup was becoming one of the most useful machines in American life. Ford understood that not every customer needed the same thing. Some wanted a light-duty pickup, others needed something stronger. The F-250 filled that middle ground, and this helped Ford create something extremely powerful, a truck lineup where customers could move up without leaving the brand. If an F-100 wasn't enough, there was an F-250. If you needed even more, there were heavier-duty F-Series models. That sounds obvious today, but it was an important strategy. Ford wasn't simply selling pickups, it was creating a complete ecosystem of working vehicles. And the F-250 was a crucial part of it. But here's where the story gets ironic. The more successful the F-100 became, the more the F-250 disappeared from the public imagination. The F-100 became associated with classic American styling. The F-250 became associated with work. And collectors tend to romanticize the former. People remember the beautiful F-100s, the chrome, the rounded body, the iconic grille, the trucks restored to perfection. The F-250 often had a very different life. It was used, and used hard. It hauled, it towed, it carried, it worked. And when something broke, it was repaired. When it got old, it was replaced. Nobody expected these trucks to become collectible. That may be one of the biggest reasons so many disappeared. Think about what happens to a work truck. A family car might spend decades protected in a garage. A sports car might be carefully preserved. A luxury car might become a collector's piece. But a work truck? It gets thrown into the hardest jobs. That's exactly what it was purchased for. So the F-250s that survived had to be tough. And that makes surviving examples especially interesting today, because you're not just looking at an old Ford pickup, you're looking at a truck that may have spent decades earning its keep. There's also something important about the F-250's place in American culture. The F-100 became the pickup for almost everyone. The F-250 represented something more serious. It was increasingly associated with people who needed real capability. Farmers, contractors, builders, ranchers, businesses, people whose livelihood depended on their truck. To them, the F-250 wasn't a lifestyle accessory, it was equipment. And that distinction is important because it shows how the American pickup market was beginning to split into different categories. Some trucks were becoming personal vehicles, others remained serious working machines. And Ford wanted to serve both groups. The F-250 helped make that possible, but there's another reason this truck deserves attention. The F-250 name would eventually become enormous. Modern F-250s are huge, powerful, sophisticated, capable of towing enormous loads. But the early F-250 was much simpler. No giant touchscreen, no massive luxury cabin, no complicated electronics, just a straightforward truck designed around one fundamental idea: do the job. And that's what makes an early F-250 so fascinating. It represents the beginning of a name that would eventually become synonymous with heavy-duty American pickups. But back then, it was just a new Ford truck trying to prove itself. And Ford had plenty of competition. Chevrolet had its heavier-duty models. GMC had serious work trucks. Dodge was fighting for commercial buyers. International was deeply established among farmers and businesses. The F-250 had to earn its reputation, and it did that the old-fashioned way, by working. That's why the story isn't really about speed or styling, it's about trust. A contractor needed to know that his truck would start. A farmer needed to know it could handle a heavy load. A business owner needed to know it could survive years of daily use. The F-250 was designed around those expectations. And eventually, that reputation would become one of Ford's greatest advantages. People trusted the F-Series. They knew there was a Ford truck for almost every job. But history tends to simplify things. The F-100 becomes the classic. The F-150 becomes the legend. The F-250 becomes the workhorse nobody talks about. That's not entirely fair, because the F-250 was doing something the F-100 wasn't designed to do. It was stepping into a more demanding world. And it was doing it without losing the basic advantages of the F-Series: practicality, durability, simplicity, and versatility. Imagine seeing a restored 1953 F-250 today. At first, you might think that's just an old Ford pickup. But then you look at the badge, F-250, and suddenly the story changes. This wasn't simply another half-ton truck. It was part of Ford's attempt to create a broader range of working vehicles. It was designed for buyers who needed more. And that simple idea would eventually become a huge part of Ford's success. The F-250 also represents something bigger about American history. The 1950s were a period of enormous construction and economic expansion, and trucks were essential to that process. Every house being built, every farm being modernized, every small business expanding, every construction project needed trucks. The F-250 was one of the machines helping make that growth possible. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't famous, but it was useful. And sometimes usefulness is exactly what changes a country. That's why the question at the heart of this truck is so interesting. Why did this Ford become one of the most important workhorses in the lineup, yet remain in the shadow of the famous F-100? Because the F-100 became a symbol. The F-250 became a tool. One was admired, the other was used. One ended up in collections, the other spent decades on farms, construction sites, and job sites. And ironically, that's probably why the F-250 deserves more respect. It didn't need to become a legend, it simply needed to keep working. And for generations of Americans, that's exactly what it did. The F-100 may have become the icon. The F-250 was one of the workhorses that helped build the legend.
5. 1961 Ford F-100 4x4, when the pickup learned to leave the road. When did Ford realize that a pickup needed to be more than just a two-wheel drive work truck? For decades, the American pickup was built around a simple idea: put it on the road and make it work. But what happened when the road ended? Farmers had muddy fields, construction crews had rough job sites, ranchers had dirt roads, and people living far from paved roads needed something more capable. That's where the 1961 Ford F-100 4x4 becomes fascinating. Because this wasn't simply an ordinary F-100 with a different badge. It represented a major change in the way Americans thought about pickup trucks. The truck didn't have to stay on the pavement anymore. It could go where the work was, and that changed everything. By the early 1960s, four-wheel drive was becoming increasingly important for working vehicles. The technology wasn't new. Four-wheel drive trucks had existed for years. But Ford was helping bring the idea into the mainstream pickup market. And the timing was perfect. America was expanding rapidly. Construction was booming. Agriculture was becoming more mechanized. Roads were improving, but plenty of places still had no pavement at all. For a farmer, that meant a normal two-wheel drive truck could become almost useless when the ground turned into mud. For a construction worker, a job site could be nothing more than dirt, rocks, and steep terrain. For a rancher, the nearest paved road might be miles away. A pickup that could only work on good roads had limitations. Ford's 4x4 addressed those limitations. And suddenly, the pickup became something more than a transportation tool. It became an all-terrain work machine. Think about the difference. A normal pickup says, "Give me a road and I'll carry the load." A 4x4 says, "I don't care if there's a road." That was a powerful idea. And the 1961 F-100 4x4 was arriving during an important period in Ford's truck development. The F-Series was already established. Ford had learned what American buyers wanted. Now the company was expanding the capabilities of the pickup. The goal wasn't simply to make the truck bigger, it was to make it more useful. And four-wheel drive did exactly that. But there's an important detail here. The early 1960s 4x4 pickup wasn't a luxury vehicle. It wasn't designed for weekend adventures. It wasn't built for Instagram. It was equipment, serious equipment. The people buying these trucks often had a practical reason for needing four-wheel drive. They needed to reach remote locations. They needed traction. They needed to move equipment through difficult terrain. They needed a truck that wouldn't stop when the pavement ended. And that's why the 4x4 pickup became so important. It expanded the definition of what a pickup could do. But there was a cost. Four-wheel drive systems added weight. They added complexity. They added expense. And they could make the truck more difficult to maintain. So Ford had to answer an important question. Was the extra capability worth it? For many buyers, the answer was absolutely yes. Because when you're stuck in mud with a heavy load, a cheaper two-wheel drive truck doesn't feel like a bargain anymore. It feels useless. The 4x4 offered something much more valuable: confidence. You could enter rough terrain knowing that the truck had a much better chance of getting through it. And that changed how people used pickups. Suddenly, a truck wasn't restricted to farms and roads. It could work in forests, construction sites, mountains, remote properties, off-road locations, and difficult weather. The pickup was becoming a universal tool, and Ford was part of that transformation. But here's something interesting. Today, four-wheel drive pickups are everywhere. You can walk into almost any American truck dealership and find a 4x4. Many buyers choose four-wheel drive even if they rarely need it. It's become normal, almost expected. But in the early 1960s, that wasn't the case. The idea was still evolving. The average American pickup buyer didn't automatically assume that a truck needed four-wheel drive. Ford had to demonstrate why it mattered. And the best argument wasn't advertising, it was experience. Take the truck into the mud, take it onto a rough construction site, drive it through snow, climb a dirt road, and suddenly the advantage becomes obvious. That's how the 4x4 pickup earned its reputation. Not through luxury,
through getting people unstuck. There's also something visually appealing about the early F100 4x4. It still has the classic early 1960s Ford pickup shape. Simple body, straight lines, large grille, separate bed. But underneath that familiar appearance is a much more capable machine. And that's part of what makes these trucks so interesting today. They don't look extreme. They don't look like modern off-road monsters. They look relatively simple. But they were helping create the foundation for the modern 4x4 pickup, the kind of truck that would eventually dominate everything from ranch work to recreational off-roading. The F100 helped prove that the same vehicle could be both practical and adventurous. That combination would become incredibly powerful. But the story also reflects a larger change in American culture. People were becoming more mobile. They were moving farther away from city centers. They were exploring, they were building, they were working in places where roads weren't always perfect. And the pickup truck was adapting to that lifestyle. The 4x4 wasn't simply another option, it was a response to a changing America. And Ford understood that. But the competition was watching too. Chevrolet had four-wheel drive pickups. GMC had them. International had a long history with 4x4 trucks. Jeep was building its reputation around off-road capability. So Ford had to prove that the F-Series could compete in this new category. And the F100 4x4 helped do exactly that. It showed that Ford didn't have to choose between a comfortable everyday pickup and a serious off-road work vehicle. The same truck could be both. That's an idea we take for granted today, but it was a significant evolution. And there's another reason these trucks are fascinating. They were built to be used. Like many old work trucks, they weren't necessarily treated gently. They were exposed to mud, snow, dust, heavy loads, rough roads, and constant work. Many of them were eventually worn out. Others were modified, some were abandoned. And that's why surviving examples can be surprisingly special. You're looking at a truck that may have spent decades doing exactly what it was designed to do, work where ordinary vehicles couldn't. Imagine finding one today, a weathered 1961 Ford F100 4x4 sitting behind an old farm building. The paint is faded, the wheels are covered in dirt, the body shows years of use. But underneath all that age is an important piece of Ford history. A truck that helped prove that a pickup didn't have to stop when the pavement ended. And that's why the question is so interesting. When did Ford realize that a pickup needed to be more than just a two-wheel drive work truck? The answer wasn't a single moment. It was a gradual realization. American workers were demanding more capability. Rural roads were demanding more traction. Construction sites were becoming more difficult. And Ford was responding. The 1961 F100 4x4 was part of that transition. It helped turn four-wheel drive from a specialized feature into a much more important part of the American pickup formula. And eventually, that formula would become almost universal. Today, when you see a Ford F-150, F-250 or F-350 with four-wheel drive, it doesn't seem unusual at all. But that capability has a history. And trucks like the early F100 4x4 helped write it. So this isn't simply the story of an old Ford pickup. It's the story of the moment the American pickup began to escape the road. A truck that could carry a load was useful. A truck that could carry that load almost anywhere was something completely different. The 1961 Ford F100 4x4 wasn't just another pickup. It was a sign that the future of the American truck was no longer limited by the pavement.
6. 1965 Ford F-250 Camper Special. The pickup built for America's camping obsession. Why did Ford build a pickup specifically for America's new obsession with camping? In the 1960s, something was changing in America. People were buying houses in the suburbs. They had more disposable income. Highways were expanding. And Americans were discovering a new kind of freedom. The freedom to pack up the family and go camping. But there was a problem. A normal pickup could carry a load, A camper was a completely different story. Once you put a heavy slide-in camper into the bed, the truck suddenly had to carry hundreds or even thousands of extra pounds. The suspension had to work harder, the brakes had to work harder, the tires had to handle more weight, and the entire truck had to remain stable. Ford saw the opportunity, and in 1965, the company offered something specifically designed for this new lifestyle, the Ford F-250 Camper Special. At first, it might sound like just another option package, but it represented something much bigger. Ford had realized that the pickup was no longer only a work machine, it was becoming a family adventure vehicle, and that was a major change. For decades, trucks had been associated with farms, construction sites, and businesses. Now people were buying them for something completely different: vacation. Imagine a family in 1965. They don't want to stay in a hotel, they don't want to travel by train, they want to see America. They want mountains, lakes, national parks, open roads. So they buy a camper. They slide it into the bed of their Ford pickup, and suddenly they have a tiny home on wheels. It sounds normal today, but at the time, this was becoming a cultural revolution, and Ford wanted to be part of it. The F-250 was the perfect starting point. It was already more capable than a basic light-duty pickup, but the Camper Special went further. Ford equipped it specifically for the demands of carrying a camper. The goal was simple: make a truck stronger where it mattered. Because a camper changes the truck completely. A normal empty pickup has plenty of room to absorb bumps. Add a heavy camper and everything changes. The rear suspension carries much more weight. The center of gravity becomes higher. Braking becomes more important. Handling changes. Even the tires suddenly become critical. Ford understood that customers needed more than just a bigger engine. They needed a truck designed around the entire load. That's what made the Camper Special interesting. It wasn't simply marketing, it was engineering for a new type of customer. And that customer was growing rapidly. The 1960s were the golden age of the American road trip. Interstate highways were connecting cities across the country. Americans were buying larger cars. More families owned vehicles, and camping was becoming increasingly popular. The pickup became the perfect platform. You could drive to the campsite and bring your bedroom with you. No hotel, no reservations, no fixed destination. Just a truck, a camper, and the open road. And Ford was smart enough to realize that this wasn't just a temporary trend. It could become an entire market. That's exactly what happened. The camper industry grew, truck manufacturers responded, and pickup trucks became increasingly specialized for recreational use. The Camper Special was part of that transformation. But there's an important irony here. Today, people think of the F-250 as a heavy-duty work truck, powerful, large, capable. But in 1965, Ford was already realizing that capability could be used for something besides work. The same strength that helped a contractor haul equipment could help a family carry a camper across the country. That versatility became one of the biggest advantages of the American pickup. One truck, many lifestyles. And that's why the Camper Special matters. It helped blur the line between commercial vehicle and personal vehicle. The pickup wasn't just something you bought because you needed it for your job. You could buy one because you wanted to go somewhere. And Ford was adapting to that new customer. There's also something fascinating about the timing. The F-250 Camper Special appeared during a period when the American pickup was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Trucks were getting better interiors, better suspension, more comfortable cabins, more powerful engines, and more specialized equipment. The days of the pickup being nothing more than a basic workhorse were ending. The truck was becoming a lifestyle vehicle. But it still had to work. That's what made the Camper Special different from a normal family car. You could load a camper on Monday and use the same truck for work on Tuesday. You could tow equipment, carry supplies, then drive your family to the mountains on the weekend. That flexibility was extremely attractive, and it helped create the modern pickup culture we know today. Look at today's trucks. People buy them for towing boats, carrying campers, off-road adventures, family trips, construction, farming, and everyday transportation. The modern pickup can be almost anything. But that didn't happen overnight. It evolved through specialized vehicles like the Camper Special. Ford was essentially asking, what if the pickup isn't just a work truck? What if it becomes the base for an entire lifestyle? And the answer was obvious. People loved the idea. There was something deeply American about it. A powerful truck, a camper, a long highway, and no need to stay in one place. The road itself became the destination. But carrying a camper wasn't easy. This wasn't just about putting a box in the bed and driving away. Weight distribution mattered, suspension mattered, braking mattered, tire capacity mattered. The truck had to be prepared for a much heavier load than an ordinary pickup might normally carry. That's why the F-250 made sense. Its heavier-duty construction gave Ford a better foundation for this new type of vehicle, and the Camper Special package made the truck more suitable for the job. It was a practical response to a very modern problem. Americans wanted to travel farther with more stuff, and Ford gave them a truck capable of doing it. There's also something cultural story hiding behind this vehicle. The 1960s were a period when Americans increasingly saw travel as freedom. You didn't have to wait for a train. You didn't have to follow a fixed schedule. You could simply get in your truck and leave. The camper made that freedom even greater. Your truck carried everything you needed: food, clothes, equipment, sleeping space, and your family. That combination created a new kind of American road trip, and Ford wanted its trucks to be right in the middle of it. Today, a 1965 F-250 Camper Special might look like a simple old pickup, but it represents a major change in how Americans used trucks. It was no longer enough for a pickup to simply carry a load. It needed to support a lifestyle. And that idea would become enormously important. Because once people discovered that a pickup could take them camping, they discovered countless other possibilities: boats, trailers, motorcycles, off-road vehicles, travel, adventure. The pickup became a platform for almost anything. The Camper Special was one of the early examples of Ford deliberately building a truck around that lifestyle. And that's why the mystery is so interesting. Why did Ford build a pickup specifically for America's new obsession with camping? Because Ford realized that the American pickup was changing. The worksite wasn't the only place these trucks were going. They were heading into the mountains, across the highways, toward lakes, into national parks, and into the dreams of families who wanted to see more of the country. The 1965 Ford F-250 Camper Special wasn't simply a stronger pickup. It was a sign of what the American truck was becoming: a workhorse during the week, a family adventure machine on the weekend, and eventually a symbol of freedom on four wheels. Ford wasn't just building a truck for campers, it was helping build the idea of the American road trip pickup.
7. 1970 Ford F-100 Sport Custom, when the pickup became a lifestyle. When did Ford stop treating pickups as work tools and start selling them as personal vehicles? For most of American history, a pickup truck had a very simple purpose: work. You bought one because you needed to haul something: tools, lumber, farm equipment, supplies, maybe a trailer. Nobody expected a pickup to be stylish. Nobody expected it to be comfortable, and nobody thought of it as a personal statement. But by 1970, that attitude was beginning to change, and Ford was paying attention. The 1970 Ford F-100 Sport Custom is a perfect example of that transition. It was still a real pickup. It still had a cargo bed. It could still work. But Ford was starting to sell something more than capability. It was selling style. And that was a huge change. Because by the early 1970s, America had discovered that a pickup could be more than a tool. It could be something you actually wanted to drive. Think about what was happening at the time. Muscle cars were everywhere. Young Americans were obsessed with performance. Cars were becoming expressions of personality. Bright colors, stripes, chrome, bucket seats, powerful engines. The automobile wasn't simply transportation anymore. It was part of someone's identity. And eventually, that attitude reached the pickup truck. Ford realized that a young buyer might not want a bare-bones work truck. He might want something that looked good cruising down the highway, something he could use for work but also enjoy on the weekend. That was the opportunity behind packages like the Sport Custom. Instead of stripping the pickup down to the essentials, Ford added styling and comfort features designed to make the truck more attractive as a personal vehicle. And that represented a major shift in thinking. Ford was no longer asking, how much can this truck carry? The company was also asking, how does this truck make the owner feel? That question would completely transform the pickup market. Because once buyers started caring about appearance, manufacturers had a reason to keep adding more. Better interiors, more comfortable seats, more attractive wheels, special paint, chrome, sporty trim, more powerful engines. Eventually, pickups would become almost as personalized as passenger cars. But in 1970, that transformation was still underway, and the F-100 Sport Custom was part of it. The interesting thing is that Ford didn't abandon the traditional pickup buyer. The truck could still work. That was the genius. You didn't have to choose between utility and style. You could have both. A construction worker could use it during the week. A young driver could take it cruising on Saturday night. A family could use it for everyday transportation. And on Sunday, it could haul whatever needed hauling. That versatility was becoming incredibly attractive, and Ford was discovering that there was a huge market for it. The pickup was beginning to move out of the farm and into the suburbs. That was one of the biggest changes in American automotive culture. As more Americans moved into suburban communities, the pickup became useful in a completely different way. You could haul furniture, carry building supplies, tow a small trailer, work on the house, go camping, or simply drive around town. The truck didn't have to be your job. It could be your life. And that's where the Sport Custom becomes important. It represents the moment when manufacturers began deliberately designing pickups for people who didn't necessarily need one for work. That sounds normal today, but it was a major change. Today, someone might buy a pickup because they like the way it looks. They might never put a load of lumber in the bed. In 1970, that idea was becoming much more realistic, and Ford wanted those customers. The Sport Custom was essentially Ford saying, you can have a truck because you want one, not because you need one. That distinction changed the entire industry. But the transformation didn't happen overnight. For decades, American pickups had already been becoming more comfortable. Cabins were getting better. Ride quality was improving. Engines were becoming more powerful. Manufacturers were adding options. The Sport Custom was simply another step in that evolution. But culturally, it was a very important step, because styling was now becoming part of the product. The truck had to look good parked in the driveway. It had to look good cruising through town. It had to appeal to younger buyers, and it had to compete emotionally with passenger cars. That was a completely different game. Ford was no longer selling only practicality. It was selling image. And that opened the door to something much bigger, the rise of the personal pickup. Eventually, trucks would get special performance packages, luxury interiors, four-door cabins, off-road packages, huge wheels, premium audio, and technology that would have seemed impossible in 1970. But the basic idea was already there. A pickup can be a lifestyle vehicle. The Sport Custom was part of that cultural shift. And there's something ironic about it. The truck still looked like a truck. It still had a separate cargo bed. It still had the proportions of a traditional pickup, but the message had changed. A work truck says, I need this. A Sport Custom says, I want this. That's a subtle difference, but it changed everything.
It changed how manufacturers designed trucks. It changed how dealers sold them, and it changed how buyers thought about them. Suddenly, a pickup could be cool, it could be sporty, it could be personal, it could represent freedom, and that idea would become enormously powerful. Think about the American pickup market today. Some of the best-selling vehicles in the country are trucks, and many buyers aren't farmers, they aren't contractors, they don't need to haul heavy equipment every day. They buy trucks because they like them, because they like the image, because the truck has become part of their lifestyle. That transformation has roots in vehicles like the 1970 Ford F-100 Sport Custom. Ford was beginning to understand that a pickup could be more than a work tool. It could become a personal vehicle with a bed. And that sounds almost obvious today, but it wasn't always obvious. In fact, it took decades for manufacturers to fully embrace the idea. The Sport Custom was one of the signs that the change was happening. The young buyer of 1970 didn't necessarily want the cheapest possible truck. He wanted something that reflected his personality, something with attitude, something that looked different from the basic fleet truck sitting on a construction site. Ford gave him that option. And once buyers discovered that they liked stylish pickups, there was no going back. Manufacturers started competing over appearance, then comfort, then performance, then luxury, and eventually the pickup became almost as personalized as passenger cars. But all it started with a simple change in attitude. The truck didn't just have to work, it had to be desirable. And that's why the 1970 F-100 Sport Custom is more important than it might first appear. It wasn't the fastest Ford, it wasn't the most powerful, it wasn't the rarest, but it represented a major shift in the identity of the American pickup. The truck was becoming something you could be proud to own, something you could personalize, something you could drive even when you had nothing to haul. And that's a very different kind of vehicle. So when we ask, when did Ford stop treating pickups as work tools and start selling them as personal vehicles? There wasn't one exact day, but by 1970, the change was clearly underway. Ford was beginning to understand that a pickup could appeal to the same emotions as a car: style, freedom, youth, personality, and pride. The F-100 Sport Custom stood right in the middle of that transformation. It was still a work truck, but it was starting to become something else. A truck you didn't just need, a truck you actually wanted.